Welcome to the podcast where three longtime friends talk about video games from the average gamer's perspective. My name is Andrew Kimball.
I'm Dylan Wren.
And I'm Aubrey Summer.
And
we are your friendly neighborhood gamers.
Welcome back to the neighborhood, and thanks for stopping by. In this episode, we are asking the question, is the pursuit of better and more realistic visuals ruining modern gaming? Before we dive in, if you enjoy our content, if you enjoy this podcast, we would greatly appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star rating and review on your podcast app of choice if it allows it, or if you're watching this or listening to it on YouTube, a like, a comment, subscription to our channel has the same kind of effect as far as an easy, free way to support us, and we would really appreciate it. With that being said, Aubrey has now, episodes are coming out of order, but as far as recording this, Aubrey is now on her leave to go have her baby. It has not happened quite yet, but could be any day now, so that is why it is just Dylan and myself here tonight. How's it going, Dylan?
Can't complain. So it's an interesting topic because it's been a hot take in the past, I think, that we've talked ad nauseum about, and I'm looking forward to diving into this discussion again. So
yeah, I think it's going to be interesting for similar reasons that you said, because it's something that's kind of always present and like discussed, something that we've talked about on Level Playing Field, and it kind of crops up in a lot of our like industry conversations that we have on this show. But I think now more than ever, as far as console generations and them being more in line visually to PCs and TVs catching up, and like just everything is kind of plateaued. It feels like that it's an interesting crossroad to discuss of like, is it worth developers' time and energy to be pursuing this so aggressively for what it's like costing the publishers and studios, and then what it's costing the gamers as far as like game releases slowing way down. Like, it used to be you get a new game every couple years from the same series, and now it's been an entire, like, GTA 5 skipped a generation, right? The GTA series skipped a generation, which, they're kind of a unique studio. They're kind of like a special case, but same thing with like a lot of these, especially kind of single player story, like action games. You're seeing the time in between releases slow down quite a bit. And so it's like for the increase in visuals and whatnot that we're getting for that, like, is that trade-off worth it? That's kind of what we're trying to tackle with this episode is, and it's something that video game companies and developers have been doing forever. They've always been trying to push the limits of realistic visuals. They've been held back by hardware and software, and every generation felt like a pretty big leap. But over the past couple of generations, it feels like that cost to value ratio in this pursuit is diminishing. And for the average gamer who potentially doesn't even have like top end hardware to take advantage of some of these visual features, like, is that worth it? So that was the idea behind this topic in this episode, and that's what we're going to be kind of pontificating on for the next hour or so.
Yeah. And I think a couple of things to kind of like throw out there out front. Number one, this is like, we don't want to get into the like some gamers can't just have normal opinions and normal, and so we're not trying to like stir the pot. We're not trying to be like, you're wrong if you want super realistic graphics or, whatever. We're just throwing out there just kind of this question of like, is it like we keep seeing budgets for these games skyrocket. There's a lot of talk about how because budgets are so big, that's why there's so many layoffs. That's why there's so many like game studios are not wanting to like make newer, more innovative games. That's why they're kind of playing it safe, is because it costs so much to make a game. And so like, is this idea of like, oh, it has to look like I'm playing a movie, potentially holding back games from, like, that's just kind of what we're thinking about. We're not saying that we don't like cool looking graphics. And so, number one, this is not meant to be an attack on anybody or anything. And number two, I think it's important to toss out there that when we're talking about graphics, we're talking about like how the game looks visually. We're not talking about graphics in like a necessarily like, is it stuttering? Is it hitching? Is it like, like,
Yeah, I see that more as
those
like
are kind of two
performance.
separate things. Yeah. Like that's a more performance-y thing. But I know sometimes like frame rate can kind of bridge the gap of like graphics and performance. And so sometimes when people talk about graphics, people get really hung up on the frame rate, even though your eyes can't really see that many frames per second. But
7 minutes
I know.
in, 5 minutes or whatever.
Right. So, which I don't even remember if it was this show. I know, friend of the show, Joe and I have had discussions about like, yeah, I don't think frame rate and graphics matters nearly as much as people make, or frame rate and graphics make it. I don't think frame rate and graphics matter nearly as much as some people make it out. And he disagreed. I think really what he was talking about, potentially, I could be wrong, is performance, which is tied to frame rate. And so I just wanted to clarify that when we're talking about graphics, I think we're talking about like, does the game look, does Indiana Jones look exactly like a photorealistic young Harrison Ford in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle,
Yeah, we're talking about like, can you see the pores on the character's face, and how many blades of grass are flowing in the wind at any given moment, and things like that. So, and I will say, like, I think just talking about our content and what we do here, I think we're pretty good at kind of having a well-rounded discussion, because I'm like coming to this topic personally, I'm kind of torn about it. Like, I'm genuinely asking the question because on the one hand, like, I see the cons and the potential like negative impacts that this is having on the industry, and like, all the things we mentioned opening this episode up. On the flip side of that, like, I just started playing Assassin's Creed Shadows at the time of recording this, and it's probably the best looking game in the series. And the lighting is some of like the best lighting I've seen in a game, and the like weather effects and things that happen in that game, it's awesome. And I think it definitely elevates the experience above what it would be without it. But on the flip side of that, I also really love, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which are very stylized, very simple. But I think a lot of that goes back to like the intention and like the heart of the game. Like, it was definitely the artistic intention for Assassin's Creed to look the way that it does, whereas some games I feel like are pursuing this level of fidelity when they don't necessarily have to, and they would be just as good without it. Or some games pursue it to the point, like Naughty Dog games, for example, or even we talked about Rockstar a little bit earlier. Like, Rockstar games look incredible, and I definitely think like Red Dead Redemption 2 is a better game because of how good it looks. But there's like a very small percentage of gamer that's out there combing that world and finding all these like little things and intricate designs and like levels of detail that they put in that world. Whereas the majority of us played it for the 60 hours, got through the really good story, maybe did some of the open world stuff, and like then, kind of moved on. And so it's like, were all of those little Easter eggs and, attention to detail worth it? Maybe. Some people would argue yes, because it makes that world feel lived in and real. And like, there's very few games that can achieve that level of doing that. On the flip side, if they had cut that back by 10%, how many people would really notice?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think it's, number one, we are not, well, you do programming, but you're not like a graphics programmer or whatever.
No.
Like, and I am not my background is not in game design. So part of, the assumption is that it takes significantly more time and effort to make a game that looks like GTA or Red Dead or a Naughty Dog game than it does to make a Breath of the Wild. Like that's my kind of assumption, or even, like a World of Warcraft, but I think the bigger piece there is making it feel realized and lived in, because and this is something that I think about is, playing through a game like Knights of the Old Republic back in the early 2000s. I assume, I don't know, actually, I think it was the early 2000s.
Yeah, somewhere in there.
That game at the time felt real and lived in. And like going back now, obviously, graphically, it does not look great. I mean, it's still fine, but and I think people would say the same thing for a lot of older games, where it's like, yeah, it wasn't the most mind-blowingly impressive graphically, but it was a fun game that had like other little touches that made it feel like another one I can think of is Oblivion, right? Where they had all the NPCs have like their little schedules and whatever.
Yeah.
And like Oblivion, in my opinion, is one of the worst looking Elder Scrolls games. So, and so like that's another thing I guess that I think about, where it's like, obviously there's some of it where it's once you see the better it's like going back and watching something in standard def after like high def has been a thing for forever. Like sometimes when I'll go back and pull old trailers from an old game that we talk about, I'm like, ooh, 480p, like rough. At the same time, if it was a fun game and they did some other things, it still invoked all of these feelings that just having nice graphics can also invoke. And it, I think, invokes it in a way that is much more lasting than a good looking game, if that makes sense. Because for a while there, we'd have every new generation, we'd have like Xbox to 360, there were like the showcase games early on that were like, oh, look at the graphics. Same with Xbox One. Rise is one that I can think of, where it was like showing off the Kinect and also really good looking graphics. I don't think there are a ton of people who really think a whole lot about Rise, that doesn't make it a bad game, but just because it had very nice looking graphics doesn't make it like isn't enough to give it that lasting impact, I guess, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
So I think about that, where it's like, we've been playing games since they were pixels on a screen, like very pixelated, and people were having fun. I remember like my grandpa watching me play NHL 99 back in like 1999, and he was blown away at how realistic that looked. And it's kind of just like, even today, the best looking games still look like video games. Like they still don't look real to me, at least. Like there's still enough about it where it's like, yep, that's a video game.
Yeah.
So it's we have not achieved hyperrealism, and it's to the point where it's like, is this detrimental? And I think if you're cutting, like if that is the thing your game is about, is just looking beautiful, and you're not focusing on that gameplay, then maybe it is detrimental, you know?
Yeah. And I think you can have a beautiful looking game and it lean more into like a specific art style or art direction versus like photorealism. And a lot of times those games age better. You know, it's a lot easier to go back and play Wind Waker now than it would be to go back and play like Twilight Princess, for example, just on like a purely visual, you know, level. One of those pretty much looks the same, you know. Granted, like you were talking about 480p and stuff, and I was thinking, yeah, but we were also playing these games on like old TVs that, you know, those games looked better on those TVs, I think. But I think a lot of it too is not just photorealism for like character models and, you know, trying to imitate real life. I think a lot of it too is like we've gotten to the point where we're like the hardcore, your digital foundries are geeking out over like lighting engines and ray tracing and like reflections, and none of that really adds to the like hook of a game necessarily. It doesn't add to that fun factor. Like I said, I think that Assassin's Creed Shadows looks really good, and that does add to the overall experience. Like I really like being in that world and poking around, and it feels more, you know, realized because of that. But like if the lighting wasn't as good, I would still be doing the same exact things, like assassination wise, like stealth, sneaking around, going prone, you know, trying not to get spotted, like all the Assassin's Creed things. And so that, and those things I feel like make such a little impact, and like lots of people don't even use them because the games are either like poorly optimized and you have to have like a super good PC to take advantage of them, or they're just not really that widely available on consoles. And if they are, most players opt for performance mode over, because they would rather have the smoother gameplay than have the like 4K ray tracing, you know, whatever. So, I mean, I think that right there tells you that gamers, majority of them, if they're picking performance mode, care more about like the feel of the game than getting that like extra bump in like visual pizzazz.
Well, and it's something too that I think about, like you mentioned, like a lot of you have to have more than just an Xbox to take advantage of some of these features. Like I know that there are a bunch of features in games that I can't take advantage of, even though I have an Xbox Series X, because my TV's kind of old, you know? It's still a nice flat screen, like HD TV, but it doesn't have some of the like high dynamic range lighting features, or, you know, some of these like other
the higher refresh rate and stuff like that.
Yeah. And so, you know, that's not necessarily saying like, oh, they shouldn't bother with this because I can't use it. You know, I don't think that's a good reason, but it is one of those things where it's, if that kind of stuff is costing time and resources that could be dedicated to like making sure that that core gameplay loop is maybe a little bit better. One that I think of more in recent memory is Concord, right? I thought Concord looked good, you know, like art style wise. I think people had issues with some of the like the color scheming and like just design pieces of it, but
Right.
like visually it looked good. Graphically, it looked good. The gameplay wasn't fun, I guess. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, if we had maybe focused less on, having this game look as good as it does, and maybe focused a little bit more on like making a game that was fun, would we be talking about Concord in the past tense today? I don't know. Um, it's something too that I think about when I look at like the games that do super well, right? Like this year, some of the games that have reviewed very well have been Monster Hunter, which looks good, but it's by no means like a massively like photorealistic or like super great visual game.
Yeah, it doesn't even look as
like
good as
it's
the Resident Evil games, which are made by Capcom.
yeah, like in the same engine, like it looks better than the previous Monster Hunter games, but it's not. They clearly spent a lot of time making sure the gameplay was good, which is why it's good. Another one that I think of is the pirate Yakuza in Hawaii. Like those games are always like visually pretty good, but also like very much like it is clear you are in a video game.
Yeah,
Like
those
it
are
is,
very gamey video games.
yeah. And so it's another one where it's just kind of like, okay, they focus on having good gameplay, maybe at the expense of not needing as much graphic power there, So I think my main point is just like your game can look as nice as it can look. If it's not fun to play, all of that time is wasted. um and especially in this day and age where it seems to be taking so much more time to do that, and also hard drive space. Like Call of Duty takes up so much room, and I think a lot of that's graphics. And I don't need the 4K graphics. You watch any professional Call of Duty player and they turn their graphics down so that they can have an easier time seeing somebody hiding in the bushes. Like
Yeah.
it's not even being used. So
Yeah, download size was something I didn't even think of because games have gotten ridiculous when it comes to how much space they take up. Like Assassin's Creed Shadows, for example, is over 100 gigs, which it's like it's ridiculous. We mentioned a little bit earlier talking about kind of like generational jumps and how there was a very obvious jump from Xbox to 360 and even from 360 to Xbox One. Definitely, from like Super Nintendo to N64, you went full 3D. And it feels like that jump doesn't even exist anymore. At least from Xbox One to, well, and it doesn't help that we had all these like kind of mid generation, like
the Xbox One X.
Yeah, exactly. Which, was more powerful, blah, blah, blah. But like the fact that you could play God of War, Ragnarok, Miles Morales, Horizon Forbidden West, like Elden Ring. I mean, the fact that you can just play all of these games on last gen if you wanted to or had to. Sure, they're not going to be. It's not going to be quite as good as an experience. You're definitely probably the biggest jump this generation was putting SSDs in our consoles because now things load a lot faster, and that was very noticeable. That doesn't really have an impact on visuals, and so if you can put up with some longer load times and maybe some lower frame rates like you're talking about depending on what game it is, like you can play a lot of these games on the last generation and it's the same exact game. Like they look pretty much like, obviously the new one's going to look a little bit better, but it's not like when we went from Xbox 360 to Xbox, like seeing Assassin's Creed Black Flag, which was a good looking game on the 360, and then seeing Assassin's Creed Unity on the Xbox One, like granted, that game had a rough launch, but it's still probably one of the best looking visually Assassin's Creed games that they ever made. And that was the case for so many, like looking at the Uncharted series, jumping to Uncharted 4, or looking at, let's see, what other games were like really obvious.
I mean, Witcher 2 to 3.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was a huge, huge improvement.
That also had some like, time in between, but like that was during when it was not a like, oh, this is cross platform or cross gen. Like
it was impossible to do Witcher 3 on the previous generation. They wouldn't have been able to do it. Exactly.
Like I'm sure that there were some previous like cross gen games on like I know Xbox 360, the one that I'm thinking of was Shadow of Mordor. I know that that was on the 360 and on the Xbox One, but it was a much different game on 360 than it was on the Xbox One, let alone like graphically. And a lot of the Assassin's Creed games that you were just talking about, like they didn't even release, like they released what, Rogue or something? Like they released another different game.
It was Rogue.
Because they couldn't put a game like
Unity
on for technical reasons, but also because back then like technical meant graphical as well, like
yeah, I remember Titanfall 1 was one of those cross-gen games, 360 to Xbox One, and I remember I had the Xbox One with Titanfall and my brother had the 360 version because he still had a 360, and like it was very noticeable the difference in those games. And like you said, that was kind of the first time we really started seeing those cross-gen games, and they were different experiences. Like Shadow of Mordor had a bunch of stuff cut back, and I think Destiny was cross-gen, the first one.
Yeah,
I don't remember what all
I don't remember if it came out cross-gen or if it got a like
an upgrade,
cross-gen upgrade. Yeah, I don't remember.
But like this generation, this most recent one, I mean, they had a select few kind of PlayStation 5 only games with like Demon Souls Remake and Returnal and a few like that took advantage of like some of the haptic feedback and stuff. But for at least 2 years, if not longer, we were getting the same exact game released on both generations because gaming boomed in that generation and they didn't want to lose their PS4 player base.
Yeah.
I mean, that was part of it, but also it was like we weren't seeing the promised jump in graphics and jump in like they were talking about how you'd only be able to like they'd be able to do things on this generation that they couldn't do before. And we saw a little bit of that, I guess, in like Ratchet and Clank, where you're like jumping through portals and stuff, and it was like instant loading and things like that. But we don't really see a lot of that. Games have stayed pretty samey, especially in the AAA space, and so like they still run on last gen, and a lot of that is visuals. Like it reminds me kind of. Well, I mean, it's kind of across all of tech, like iPhones, TVs, everything. It was like for a while there. Every couple of years it was worth upgrading because like this one looks so much better, performs so much better, has so like way better specs, and like everything's kind of plateaued now where we're getting these little incremental upgrades to everything. And I think gaming is the same, except it feels like those incremental upgrades and these tiny tweaks that we're getting visually are costing way more time and money than I feel like I feel like they justify because, we wait years and years and years for the next installment of a series we like. And a lot of times it's like, oh, I mean, yeah, this looks better, but it's not like earth shattering.
Yeah, like it looks better, but it's not maybe doing a whole lot differently that they couldn't. Like that is something that I am interested to see with GTA 6. Like I'm sure there will be things GTA 6 does that they couldn't have done on an Xbox One
Yeah.
or even a 360. But also like keeping in mind that GTA 5 came out on the 360. Like if all we're seeing is like a few more pedestrians and like some better quality visuals, it will kind of be like you could have told this story 6 years ago, you know? You didn't need to wait until it looked this good. And I think too, if having perfect graphics really mattered that much, then the Switch shouldn't be selling that well, you know? And it is, Um and that's not to again, I think it's important to recognize that like just because something's not trying to be photorealistic doesn't mean it has bad graphics. Um but like Animal Crossing is one of the best-selling games, and like Animal Crossing doesn't have hyper realistic graphics. And that's not to say that they didn't work on their graphics, that they didn't make it look nice, but they didn't like have to sacrifice any, like they didn't sacrifice gameplay necessarily in order to, like, in my opinion, in order to make it look like so that I could see individual hairs on Tom Nook's face, like um, it probably helped that it's on a Switch, and so couldn't you couldn't do that. But I think that's one of the reasons that Nintendo seems so much more innovative than a lot of other game companies out there making games right now, is because in a sense they are handicapping themselves a little bit and being forced to be more creative because graphically the Switch has been pushed about as high as much as it can do with things like Tears of the Kingdom, and so you don't have that space to play in as much, and so you have to play in other spaces, which ends up looking like gameplay innovation, and I think to me that's the part where I think it can potentially, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's ruining this generation, but I do think
Right.
that sometimes if we didn't have that space to play in, if developers weren't trying, like if the best that you could do was an Xbox One, you'd be forced to figure out gameplay wise what you could do versus just trying to make it the same thing but with better graphics, if that makes sense,
No, for sure. I think like not even gameplay, but like going back to the size of the game conversation, it's like if you weren't pursuing like the best visuals possible, then maybe you could spend more time on optimization and you could get these game sizes down. You could get PC launches to not be a coin flip every single time a game comes out. And but I think you're right about innovation and gameplay. It's like if they're chasing, like, are they chasing visuals as kind of a cop out, like, oh, look how pretty this game, because think about it, there have been like you brought up Concord, game looked fine, failed. What was the vampire Xbox game?
Oh, by Arcane, right?
Yeah, the Arcane game. So good we can't even remember the name, but like I'm sure
Right.
that game looked fine. It looked
Redfall.
Redfall. Yeah, it looked cool, looked good enough, but just the game wasn't there. I mean, Anthem looked cool.
Yeah.
Anthem, fell apart. So it is, I think, like the core idea is that like the visuals and everything have to be in service of the game and not the whole point of the game. Because I mean, Like Witcher 3 is a really good looking game, but they definitely went for a little bit more stylized world design. Like their characters look pretty realistic, but like a lot of the grass and trees and stuff in the world looks a little bit more stylized and kind of painterly. And I mean, I think that's helped it age well. We're also in the day and age where like for me to play a PS2 game now on my PS or on my PC and like have it not just look like mush, you have to kind of, mod it and emulate it and like make it look like give it some TLC. But we're in the stage of the industry now where like developers are doing that to their own games. Like The Witcher has had lots of visual upgrades and stuff as far as like their next gen upgrade and on PC and stuff, and so that's helped it age more gracefully than games of the past did. But it also continues to just blur the lines of like, I think the other CD Projekt Red game that we haven't brought up yet, Cyberpunk, which also had a rough launch.
Yeah.
I think it's
and was a good example of cross-gen being like, ooh, this is rough, versus
they should not have tried to release it on the last gen. But I think it's a good example of like visuals being in service to the experience. Like I don't think that game is just visuals. I think that, the gameplay, which it's again, the day and age of patches and stuff, it's been tweaked and reworked and made to be the best it can be at this point. But it's like, that's a fun game. It's a good RPG, tells a really good story, has interesting characters. The gunplay is fun. The build variety is interesting. And it also looks crazy good. So it's like that crazy good thing now on top of all those other factors is like, yeah, I really dig the way this looks. It's awesome playing in this really realized world with these really realized characters. But if all they had done was make really good looking characters in a really good looking world and the game sucked, then it's like, oh, well, I don't care about these visuals because the game sucks.
Yeah. Well, and I think you hit on it earlier too, where it's just kind of like, here is the new thing with better graphics, right? Like back in the day, when I'm going to use sports games here as an example. Back in the day, like you bought a new sports game partially because like, yeah, it was giving you like updated stats and updated, especially in a time before patches.
Yeah.
You were able to like, buy the next gen or the next sports game. And it's like, okay, hey, my team doesn't suck anymore because they actually had a good season last year. And so the stats have been updated. But also like visually, there was improvement year to year. Like it looked noticeably better. And now, in my opinion, MLB The Show has looked the same, at least to me, for years. For at least 4, maybe 5 years, it has looked essentially the same, Like they've kind of hit that point where now it does make it like I've been playing them on Game Pass. This year's didn't come to Game Pass, but like the past few years I've been playing them on Game Pass, so I haven't been buying them. But graphically, there was no pull to buy them. It was just, hey, you're paying for an updated roster, right?
Yeah.
And like Assassin's Creed, right? I think is another good example where it's like, okay, did Valhalla come out on Xbox One? Or was it only Series X?
I know it came out on Series X. Let me see.
Yeah, like I know I played it in that time where I might have played it on my Xbox One, but I can't remember 100%. But with that,
yeah, it came out
like
on PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4, Series X, Series S, Xbox One. So yeah, you could play that on last gen.
Yeah, so like essentially all 3 of those were probably like last gen games, right? And so Shadows is
the first next gen game.
The first next gen game, right? And like, yes, it does look better from what you're saying, but it sounds like they're also doing some other stuff, like innovating, doing some things that aren't just it's just Assassin's Creed but better looking, right? And so that to me is the important pieces where it's kind of like, yeah, I want something that isn't just like the same thing but better graphics. And that's, part of the reason I think I've fallen off of games like Call of Duty is because those have very much become like, sure they always win the award for like best sound design whenever they're giving that out because they put so much time and effort into getting all of the guns to sound exactly right. Um, but it is kind of just this, it's like, hey, this is the same thing but like with slightly better sound and slightly better graphics. um and at that point it's like, okay, well, I'm not that interested. So I'd like to see more games lean into the not just visual upgrade piece, which I think goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is budgets are skyrocketing. It's taking so much more time. One of the shortcuts is perhaps just make it look slightly better, but be same game. And that way we're not taking risks. We know that this, Assassin's Creed game is going to get an 8 out of 10 or an 85 or, whatever it is, but people are still going to buy it because they know exactly what it is. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah, and you talking about the like sports games analogy, we've kind of seen, so because those games are on a yearly schedule, we've actually started to see like regression in like visuals and gameplay and performance. And like one of the WWE games that came out a few years back was just like a completely broken mess. And it's like, because they have to release them on like a certain schedule and because they have to maintain or push the visuals to a certain degree, the game is suffering. And so, yeah, it's like, is that worth it? No. I mean, there's another conversation about games like that just needing to get like, just make it be the Madden game that gets a yearly update for the new stats and stuff. But like they are pretty unique. Like sports games are a unique section of the games industry. Make a ton of money.
Yeah. Well, and another one I think of is Hellblade 2, right? Like that. To be fair, they announced that game way too early.
Yeah.
And so it did kind of feel like it was just getting like dragged out. But it's another one of those where they put a lot of time and effort into having it look a certain, like doing all of the mocap and like having all of that like done, having the audio hallucinations and everything. And you played the game. I didn't play the second one yet. But it doesn't sound like it really was doing a whole lot for it. Like it sounded like I think it came out to like 7 out of 10 reviews, which is still decent. Like 7 out of 10s are still fun games, but it makes you wonder, like, had they spent a little less time sending people to Iceland to like scan rocks, if maybe they could have made a game that was a little bit more fun to play. So
yeah, no, Hellblade's interesting because like I think they shot themselves in the foot, like you said, announcing it so early, because I feel like the scope for that game was always supposed to be similar to the first one of linear, more about the vibes and the story than the like big grand experience. But because they were like announcing it and hyping it up, people thought, oh, this is going to be kind of like a step up from the last one. And really it only was visually. It was kind of a step down in everything else, in my opinion. And yeah, it was like that game looked crazy, but it was almost distractingly crazy. Like how it was kind of like you said, scanning rocks. It was kind of like a flight simulator or a Pokemon Go kind of thing where it's like the landscape is actually real. Like this is Iceland. And then they put like Senua in there. Like it looked insane, but yeah, I did not enjoy playing that game really. And it wasn't for the reasons that the first one I didn't enjoy because it was kind of like a messed up story and like dealt with a lot of heavy subject matter and like was a little bit on the spooky side for me. And so it was one of those where it was like, I don't enjoy it, but that's the point. Whereas this one, I didn't enjoy it because I was bored and was just not like having fun. And I thought the story sucked. And so, yeah, they made one of the craziest looking games probably of this generation, but it's not one that like, I'm going to tell you play the first Hellblade game. I'm not going to tell you need to play this one, even though it looks crazy. Like it lost its heart kind of because it was more about the visuals than the other things that made the first game so special.
Yeah, and it can be frustrating, even though I don't know how much like the industry and people actually listen to like the vocal minority of gamers that equate really good looking graphics with how good a video game is, you know? Like and art is subjective, and so if a game needs to look a certain way for you to enjoy it, like that, you're not wrong for that. But there is sometimes a vocal piece of the community that does say like I don't watch streamers because I'm too old. But the I'll see clips sometimes and it'll be like somebody talking about like, oh, the Monster Hunter game doesn't look good enough or whatever, and it's like it is a fun game though, and like you're not wrong if you don't like Monster Hunter's visual style, you know, or if you enjoy a game that has really good looking graphics, but tying is the game good to graphics, I think is detrimental, you know? Like I think having good graphics is supplementary to having a good game, but it does not a good game make, you know? If that makes sense.
No, I agree. And I think, like I said, I think the majority of like average gamers who I don't know, you know, that's kind of the perspective we want to offer, but I don't know how many of those people listen to this, because if you're listening to a podcast about video games, you're probably not the average gamer.
Spoilers. Yeah, you're above average at least.
But
so.
there's like this kind of sect of the gaming community, this like performance and visuals cult that I think is kind of spawned out of the good intentions of people like Digital Foundry. But like, I watch a Digital Foundry video, like I got caught up in this for a little while where it was like, because I have all three consoles, now I have a PC, it's like, which one am I going to get the best bang for my buck out of? Which one's going to look the best? Yada, yada, yada. And so I'm like looking at all the side-by-side comparisons and like, oh, this one, you know, it drops frames a little bit more here. And oh, this one has more occlusion and ambient lighting and blah, blah, blah. And I can see the difference when they're like stacked up next to each other. And it's like, okay, yeah, that one does look a little bit better. I played and beat Lords of the Fallen 3 times last year in a row. And it was like my favorite game that I played last year. And that game has a majority of like, or not a majority, has a lot of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but a bunch of like visual, like hitches and things. It's got a bunch of like performance, and they've ironed a lot of those things out with patches and stuff, but it's still like you get going running really fast in that game as your character, and you hit like a spot where the level's trying to load in ahead of you, and it's like you're gonna like lag out and glitch for a second, you're gonna stutter, and like there's gonna be some pop in here and there, and it's like none of that. Sure, if none of that happened, maybe I would have liked the game a little bit more. But for me, it was like the build variety, the way that the like the impact of the weapons felt, the visual style of like the magic system looked really cool. And it just took a genre that I enjoy and it did some unique things with it, put it in a really cool world, and I had a blast with it. Definitely not the perfect game as far as visuals and performance go. So I think there's a lot of, or not a lot of people, but I think there's like a group of fans, a contingent of gamers that they enjoy the hobby not for the like actual playing of the game, the like hook of the game. They enjoy looking at the tech side of things, which, that's half the fandom of PC gamers too, is like trying to see how high they can push their settings and like how good of a job they did putting together their PC. Like, can it run such and such functions and features in a game that's supposed to like, really test it used to be, can it run Crysis, back in the day.
Yeah.
And like we've said at the beginning, there's nothing wrong with that. But gaming has kind of blown out these like little subsets and subgenres of fandoms where it's like, no, what I enjoy about video games is like the very nitty gritty, like tiny minuscule details that they did with the lighting. Whereas I think the majority of video game players are like, is it fun? I like swinging around as Spider-Man. That is fun. I like winning in Call of Duty. That is fun. I like, I like my sports team winning. I like whatever the game may be. Elden Ring, I like exploring, beating the boss, whatever. Elden Ring's a good example. It has a cool art style, but it definitely doesn't have all the like crazy lighting tech and ray tracing and all that kind of stuff that like a lot of modern games are chasing. FromSoft's never been the leader in visuals, but Elden Ring is like one of the biggest games of all time because it has a fun loop and it was fun to explore that world and it was crazy and weird.
Well, and I think that's something too that is a just anecdotal observation, is that a lot of the games that are, or studios that are chasing this like hyper realism are American studios or maybe
like
some
Western
European studios, Western studios. But like a lot of the Eastern studios, like Japanese studios especially, are not as enamored with it. And that doesn't mean you don't get great looking games coming out. I mean, Final Fantasy 7 and 16 come to mind as like really good looking games. Anything Hideo Kojima has ever put out, even if I don't particularly enjoy playing them, like there is a lot of like good looking, even if it's just very boring like Pacific Northwest grasslands, like it is still very good looking. But it is interesting just anecdotally that to me that it seems to have a much higher emphasis in sort of Western game studios than it does in. There was even an article I read. I forget if it was the Monster Hunter guy or somebody else, but it was like one of the leads on a recent game that came out of Japan that was basically like, yeah, we're more focused on like just making sure our game is fun and like doing more with that. We're not as worried about some of this other stuff, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, like your game can look amazing. If it's not fun, it's not gonna, like, if I'm grading something out of 1 to 10, like, yeah, or 0 to 100 or whatever, yeah, your game looking nice might get you 5 more points, but it's not gonna, like, a majority of that score is coming from, did I have fun playing it? That's not to say that there might not be some potential biases that we're unaware of there, where it's like, if I play a really fun game but it doesn't look as good, like I do think that'd be an interesting experiment now that I'm thinking about it, where it's like you have the same game, same gameplay, but it's like you run it at low settings, medium, like average settings, and like ultra high end settings, and just kind of see what people score that at. You know, like, do they score it significantly differently? Or is it kind of like a difference of a few points where it's like, yeah, that got you a few more points when you were running at the super high settings, but the gameplay it seems to be the part that matters more, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think it has to do with the artistic intent, I guess, behind, because if a game is trying to look good and failing, like that's a lot more noticeable than making like artistic choice to go like a simpler route with your visuals. Like if a game is trying to look like photorealistic or trying to look really good and it's bad, like the Gollum game or the the King Kong game they came out, like the meme games that came out last year, like those were technically going for like, you know, realistic quote unquote graphics, but they just looked like crap. And they had a bunch of other things wrong with them as well. They weren't fun. But it's like, if the game had been fun and it still looked like that, like I do think that would take away from the experience a little bit more than a game that just didn't set out to do that at all. Like they had a different idea with what they wanted to do visually. I do think your experiment would be interesting if you like obviously have like different people playing it, because I know for me, if I know I have the option to play like the better looking version, that's what I want to play.
Yeah. Yeah, it would definitely be like a blind setting where it's just kind of like you are coming in and this is how you think the game looks. And it's
Exactly.
just kind of like what do you think of it? But I think about it too, like the last season of Game of Thrones, right? That battle with the Night King. Spoilers if you haven't watched Game of Thrones, which has been out for a while at this point. But that season overall was not great.
No.
But also specifically that episode was shot poorly. Like the
It
lighting
was
was
so
just really
dark,
bad. It
yeah.
was so dark. And so it's like when it's a bad season and it looks bad, that compounds it for sure, you know? I think people still would have had a problem with that episode being dark, like if even if it was a well-written final season of the show, you know. Um, and so I definitely don't want to say like, yeah, graphics don't matter, because I do think they matter, you know. Like there's a reason why, for the most part, even the like pixel games that are coming out now still look way better than most pixel games did. Like, even though they're going for that old school vibe, they don't look like something that was on the NES, you know? Like, they look better than that.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's not like it doesn't matter. There is like a bare minimum standard that you do want to hit, or else you're going to get docked some points, right? Um, and the more and more that we see, the more and more I think that visual standard raises, you know? Like when GTA 6 comes out, it is going to raise what people expect from a video game, you know? Um Theoretically.
Yeah.
We haven't seen it, but
Unfairly probably, because they are like literally
yeah.
the best at like visual. I think it's like them, CD
Yeah.
Projekt, and Naughty Dog probably making the best looking games out there.
Hmm. But at the same time, like it is a like they are definitely going to be like the biggest game. Like even people that don't buy Naughty Dog games or don't buy CD Projekt games, like there's going to be a huge number of people that buy GTA 6, and so that becomes that raises the baseline that you got to hit. And so I do think that there is sort of that power creep almost that happens in gaming, where people expect it to look a certain way or expect it to have a certain level of graphical fidelity. And yeah, you do probably want to hit that. But just like Game of Thrones, like if the season sucks, even if it's shot well, like there were good shots in season 8 of Game of Thrones. It was just like, well, I don't enjoy the story that is happening here. I don't enjoy the meat on the bones here, and the graphics for me in this case are kind of that like the hair or something, like if I'm running around as like a video game person and I can't see the individual arm hairs on them, that's fine.
Yeah.
But if I'm running around and like it's going to add something, but it's not going to add enough that I think we should sacrifice. Like if we have to cut gameplay features to make that happen, that doesn't seem like a good strategy.
Yeah,
So
I think I have like a couple points that go in different directions. The first one is kind of piggybacking off yours, where it's like if you can't see the arm hair, that's not a big deal. But like if your character's hair is like just
like
spazzing out or just like not moving, it's just like a solid, like say it's a female protagonist and her hair is just like a block on her head, but like they were going for realism. It's like that kind of stuff gets distracting. And what I was thinking about is that ultimately it comes down to like immersion. When you're playing a game, you want to believe in this world and you want to kind of like leave your world and be part of that world for a while. And even if that world looks like Minecraft or it looks like, Dead Cells or something like that, like obviously not photorealistic and not like the highest fidelity, if it all looks the same and cohesive and like believes in itself, then that's what you're looking for. It's when you like chase this high fidelity kind of target and you kind of miss, or you do hit that target like we were talking about with Hellblade or like Rise, but you make like a really bland game. Like that's kind of where the issue is, just like from a player level playing that game. And then not to mention the outside of like, well, as we just keep adding to these experiences, we're making like dev times take longer and all these kind of things, which are affecting just like gamers as a group of people. And so yeah, I think it ultimately comes down to like immersion, or like can I get sucked into this experience without something breaking me out of it and being jarring to the point where it's like this is taking away from the fun that I should be having. And I think that goes back to what was the like artistic intention, and did they hit that mark? And sometimes the artistic intention is to make a Last of Us Part 2 that like the characters look really crazy good and whatever. And then sometimes it's to make a Darksiders, which has very stylized and cartoony, like Blizzard inspired visuals. And they're both good games in their own right, but they're doing different things and they're not trying to compete on the same like level or the same tier. The other thing I thought about was the whole like gamers have goldfish brains, because obviously a lot of people do this as bait and just to like piss each other off, but we remember games looking like the remake versions of them that we play years later. And so there is that side of the argument or the conversation where it's like, we have come a long way, and games, games looking better, I think make them an overall better product. But then you have the people on the flip side who are like, oh, this game sucks. It looks like it came out on the PS2. And it's like, bro, have you seen a PS2 game recently? Like, have you gone back and looked at those games? Like, you look like everything is a Cybertruck. Like, what do you, it's not, they're ugly. Like, go back. Like we think of the Tony Hawk games as like the remakes that they did. But you go back and actually look at those games and it's like a few shapes stacked on top of each other on a skateboard. Like it. Yeah. And it felt good and it had good music and it was like, yeah, this is the best we've ever seen so far. But like people say that about, like Team Ninja games like Neo and Rise of the Ronin, which are not like compared to their peers are not great looking games as far as like comparing them to like an Assassin's Creed or Ghost of Tsushima or something like that. But they look way better than an Xbox 360 game, or what, like,
well, the Halo Anniversary Edition, I think is another good example. I remember Halo 1 in my mind, playing it on an Xbox at my friend's house across the street, looking like it, like, because that game you can hit, I think it's like back or something like that you can hit, and it'll like swap between the two modes. I remember it looking like the new mode, and then you'll hit that back button and it's like, holy shit, like this is ugh.
It's just a bunch of gray,
Like,
bland hallways with the goofiest looking enemies you've ever seen. Yeah.
yeah, and so sometimes I think it would be beneficial, like even like Bloodborne, when they had that like PS1 demake or whatever before Sony like did Sony things, but like you can't deny that Bloodborne looks better than what a visual representation of what somebody thinks Bloodborne would have looked like on a PlayStation 1 would be, like
Yeah. And
and even that's probably like, even that's much more generous than what it actually would have looked like on a PlayStation.
No, that demake looks a lot better than what it would have looked like back then. But on the same side, like Bloodborne's reached the age now where, like, if they were to do it and make it look like Demon Souls, like, I do think that would elevate the experience. The core game would still be great.
Yeah.
It'd still be solid. But, the game does show its age a little bit at this point, and being able to experience that world again, but in like, and that's like a significant jump if it was to look like the Demon Souls remake. It's not like, if it looked like Dark Souls 3, it's like, meh, this is a little bit better, but it's, still pretty close. But it's not like, we didn't even like touch on the Sony remasters and remakes they keep doing to essentially just resell the same game. It's like, this did not need this whatsoever. But I think it's like what you said, with dev times taking so much longer and layoffs happening and costs rising, it's like these like especially the publishers are pushing remakes, remasters, and like don't deviate too far from your franchises that are successful, and then don't deviate too far from like the core pillars of that franchise. Like, don't make too many changes to this entry in that franchise, because we need people to buy it. And it's unfortunate, because I mean, that's essentially Ubisoft is in the situation they're in right now because of that. Like, because they didn't innovate, they kept releasing the same exact game over and over, and they were rushing them and releasing buggy, broken versions of the same thing over and over again. And it's like, eventually that's just not going to work. Like, players aren't going to spend their money on that. And that's you end up where they are right now. And so there's definitely a lack of major innovation in AAA, which, thankfully we have a lot of AA and indie games out there to kind of fill that void. But it would be cool to see, like, Assassin's Creed Shadows. I keep going back to Assassin's Creed because I, just started playing it yesterday, but like, that game feels like a step up from the other RPGs. It does not feel like Black Flag or Rogue to
Assassin's Creed 3 or
no, what's I said it earlier, the French one, Unity.
the France one. Oh,
yeah, it doesn't
Unity.
feel like that jump. Like Unity, the amount of like the amount of people on the roads, like the crowds were ridiculous. The parkour was like heavily improved and tweaked and changed. Just the fidelity of the city and the character models was great. They had an entire like gear system and custom, like you could make your assassin look like whatever basically, and you were like leveling up and getting new gear. It had the like 4-player online co-op mode that I thought was super fun, that never went anywhere, but like I remember playing that with my brother and some friends, and it was the earlier days of the internet and it was super buggy and stuff like that, but it was like the idea was super fun.
Mm-hmm.
So they tried a ton of new stuff in that game, and they really pushed the envelope, and like we said, it could not have run on the previous generation. Whereas this one is like, if you like the RPG games, you'll like this one. And they did improve a lot of stuff in small ways. And, it makes the overall package feel like a step up. But it's still that RPG Assassin's Creed formula and game. It's just it's like the best version of that we've gotten so far. And a lot of the things that make it kind of feel like a step up are visual things. They did add gameplay tweaks and stuff to like how stealth and things like that make a big difference. But you pick it up and you're immediately like, oh yes, I know what this is. Whereas, in past generations, there was a little bit more, a little bit more of a jump, a little bit more flexibility to experiment or push or try things that, just isn't there. And it, hopefully we can come back to that as an industry, but it may have just gotten too big at this point, and we got to live through like the early creative good glory days, and now it's going to be a lot more commercialized. Who knows? We'll just kind of have to see.
Yeah. Well, and I think a couple of things that come to mind too is, like number one, like you said, in the like, we're hitting a point of diminishing returns. It's like we've put too many points into strength in a From Software game, and we're not like getting any real benefit from it. We should be putting our points somewhere else until we, get those up to the level we want it to be. And so an optimistic way to view this is like, maybe we are kind of like hitting a point where graphically we have kind of topped out for now at what we're at, but we're still not, it doesn't seem like, anyway. I could be wrong, because as mentioned, I'm not like a programmer. I don't have a background in game design. It doesn't really seem like we're pushing the limits of what the Xbox or PlayStation 5 hardware can do outside of maybe graphically. Like, it does feel like there's still a lot more. Like, we haven't gotten our Tears of the Kingdom where everybody's just like, holy crap, that runs on a Switch,
Yeah.
And so optimistically, maybe we're getting to the point where the diminishing returns of graphics do lead to like, well, let's try innovating in other areas. Let's try, even if it is stuff that ends up being more background stuff, like smaller file sizes, or some better sort of optimization or something. I think that could still be cool. And then also I do think, and we've talked about this I think before, of that double A space really now having a better opportunity to blow up, even though there is way more risk involved because games are expensive. And but when you don't have the like 500 person team Assassin's Creed does, where you can devote a bunch of people to focusing on graphics and just the lighting effects or whatever, when you can't rely on the graphics looking good to get you some points, you have to focus more on the game. And that doesn't mean that every AA game that comes out is fantastic, but a lot of them do tend, like, since they can't really play as much in that space with the graphics, they do seem to focus a little bit more on trying to make the game do something different, or the gameplay fun, and it does seem like it's getting easier to have the bare minimum standard of graphics look really good with things like Unreal 5, and so just having Unreal 5 be like, what was that game? Eternal Strands, right? I think that was maybe Unreal 5. I don't know.
Probably.
But like that game looked good to me. Like I was like, this is a very cool looking game. And I don't know how much time they had to devote to like the way my layman's understanding of what Unreal 5 does is it seems like it makes it much more easy to get a really good looking game without having to devote as much time into making it look super good. And obviously you can pour a bunch of time and energy and money into making it look even better. But it seems much easier to exceed that bare minimum line that a lot of people expect with things like Unreal 5. And so I hope that maybe we start seeing more stuff that innovates in other ways, because it does seem like we're running out of the ability to really innovate. Like, just where we're at as like in tech, it seems like we are the old cathode ray tube television to the like flat screen TV was massive, right? Now getting a new TV, it's like, oh, 8K, and it's like, okay, but nothing is really
What does
using
that
8K
actually
right
mean
now.
for
Like,
me?
what's that getting me? What's that doing for me? And that doesn't mean that if you're not somebody like you can be somebody who's super into that and enjoys that part of tech 100%. I don't want to take that away from you. Enjoy that. But the leaps and bounds jumps, it's the new iPhone. It's like, okay, it's got 4 cameras now or whatever. Like, cool. I don't even use the 3 that my current one has or whatever,
Yeah.
Oh, the screen is like half a like 2.5 centimeters bigger or something like that. Like, cool, but like, does it still fit in my pocket? Now it feels weird. Like, now it's a little too big for the hand or whatever. We're hitting that point where those, like you said earlier, those incremental upgrades are no longer as necessary to get, and so it's like you got to make it worth it to get the new game, and you don't do that necessarily, I think, by just making it look slightly prettier.
Yeah.
If Monster Hunter had basically just come out and been like a slightly prettier Monster Hunter world but didn't change anything else, I don't think it would be doing as well as it did. They added new monsters, they added new mechanics, they added, a new, like a whole new world. Like, and some of those things definitely would have happened even if they were just trying to go with slight visual upgrades, but they were doing more,
Yeah.
So.
And I do think that like the industry is kind of I think the industry has touched the stove and gotten burnt regarding like the live service push and the, similar, like I think with the visual, like I think they're seeing that they need to be doing something different, and it's going through some growing pains. So we'll see kind of how that shakes out over the next, 5 to however many years down the road. Like the things that are happening now, we won't really see the repercussions or the decisions made from them until, the games come out in years from now. But I think this was a good conversation. I think we, we're not here to solve anything. We're not consultants. So this is mostly just us kind of picking at it, talking about it, coming to grips with it. Hopefully you enjoyed it. It was entertaining for you to listen to. If you have thoughts on, as we roll into housekeeping, if you have your own thoughts on this topic or this subject and want to talk to us about them, jump in our Discord. That's where we hang out. It's where we conversate. Social media is just kind of a disaster these days. And I don't think anybody our age likes using it. So I do post updates to the show or of the show to social media, but that's about it. A lot of our short form content, we're pushing that to YouTube now. YouTube is the platform that we really want to try to grow on. So follow us on YouTube if you want to see that kind of stuff, if you want to see our videos. But if you want to like hang out and chat with us, Discord's the place to do that. Speaking of YouTube, Dylan, what's it looking like over there?
Yeah. So YouTube is where our podcast lives, but also our short form content and medium form content. So if you've listened to 100 or an hour and 15 minutes of this show, and you've enjoyed hearing us sort of talk about video games. We talk about video games in a much more condensed format on our YouTube channel. And so if you can listen to an hour and 15 minutes of us talking, you can probably listen to like a 7-minute video on like some games that scratch the Left 4 Dead itch that I had, or a 13-minute video on some cool female protagonists in games that Andrew's enjoyed. So if you want to hear more from us, but in a less sort of rambly conversational way, and in a more condensed, like actually goal-driven topic way, YouTube is where those videos live. We're also experimenting with breaking out some of the like segments of our show, our podcast, into smaller form videos. So if you don't listen to every podcast, you may see, some of those videos coming out there too. And if you do listen to the podcasts, hey, that's a great place for you to like interact, like leave a comment, etc. Help us get into that algorithm. But
yeah.
And
we see all those, like, if you comment on this video, if you comment on this video, we're gonna see that, and we'll probably respond and reply. So, our Discord's a great place to chat with us, but also like YouTube comments for the episodes, if that's where you like to hang out. It's another place where you can kind of share your thoughts on this topic. And YouTube is also a good place. We give a lot of first impressions and kind of talk about topics and stuff like that on the podcast. But like, if you just want kind of the nuts and bolts, do I recommend it, do I not kind of review style, we've done a lot of videos like that for various games too. So like, there's a lot of kind of informational videos on our YouTube channel. Like, if you want to hear, like Aubrey likes to say, I've given my thoughts on a lot of Souls likes. So if you're curious about that genre, there's a lot of content for you over there. So
yeah. And a lot of that content is stuff that's not necessarily going to get a full video or a full podcast.
Right.
Some of it is kind of like a much more condensed thing, and a lot of them tend to be like older games. So it's something that you're going to find on like it's not something you're gonna have to plunk down $70 on. A lot of our videos are on a game that like you can probably get in the Steam sale that's currently going on. I don't know if it's still going on.
I think so.
When this video comes out.
Oh, right.
But yeah, a lot of those are gonna be things that you can pick up for like $15 at a Steam sale, or
they might be free on Epic.
Yeah, or free on Epic, which is where a lot of our traffic comes from, apparently. So
yeah, at least recently. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's all for this one. Thank you all so much for listening or watching. We really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed this. We'll catch you on the next one. And remember to stay friendly, gamers.